for today's conference. I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to all of you for joining us today, both in person and virtually. We are honored by the presence of our distinguished participants today. We sincerely appreciate your attendance. Let us now proceed to the second day of our conference. 3 sessions will take place until 2:30 p.m. Let us proceed to session 3, discussing focus of North Korea's UPR. All speakers for session 3, please come up to the stage. Okay, we are now ready to begin. Professor of Busan University of Foreign Studies, Mr. Sung-yeol Kim, will moderate this session. Professor Kim is the first North Korean defector who became a full-time professor at a university in South Korea. Professor Kim, the floor is yours.
Hello. Good morning. Welcome to session 3. I'm Sung-yeol Kim, and I'm moderator of the session 3. Thanks to Administration of Unification and Human Asia for inviting us to the 2024 International Dialogue on North Korean Human Rights. It seems that human rights in North Korea are more serious at the moment. North Koreans' rights to live is threatened by severe economic crisis. In addition, the North Korean regime is strengthening its internal control by declaring 2 countries on the Korean Peninsula. In this circumstance, let's hear about various analyses of North Korean human rights by our panelists. This session will discuss the focus of North Korea's UPR. We have 6 panelists in our session. And let me introduce them. Lucy McKernan, UN Geneva Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch. Sean Chung, CEO at Han Voice. Boram Jung, East Asia Researcher at Amnesty International. Uni Kim, Human Rights Analyst at Database Center for North Korean Human Rights. Bada Nam, Secretary General at PS Corps. Joo-il Kim, Secretary General at International North Korean Association for Human Rights and Democracy. Each panelist has 10 minutes to discuss, and after that, we have Q&A session. Okay, first I'd like to invite Lucy McKernan to start the session.
This on? Yeah, okay. Can you hear me? Okay, hello everyone. It's really nice to be here today to talk to you about human rights in North Korea. For those who don't know, I work at Human Rights Watch, which is an independent, non-governmental organisation which is dedicated to defending and protecting human rights. And we monitor and report on violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in about 100 countries across the world. And we've been addressing human rights issues in the DPRK for more than 2 decades. We have a dedicated researcher on North Korea, Ms. Lena Yoon, who is on sabbatical at the moment, and so unfortunately is unable to be here today. We've also been involved heavily here in Geneva in the push for the human rights resolution which established the Commission of Inquiry on the DPRK back in 2013, and on resolutions at the Human Rights Council subsequent to that. For the past decade, we've also worked very closely with the OHCHR Seoul office and with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, both of which, I want to underline, are really crucial experts on human rights in the DPRK and undertake very much needed monitoring and reporting work on the situation, and in the case of the Seoul office also in promoting accountability. So I wanted to start by just mentioning our most recent report that we published on human rights in the DPRK. We published it in March this year. It's a very comprehensive report, 161 pages, and it looks at North Korea's isolationist policies and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and of the UN Security Council sanctions for human rights in North Korea. In terms of methodology, I just wanted to mention our usual methodology is to interview people on the ground, and in this case the report does draw from about 250 in-depth interviews with North Korean escapees. But of course, due to the near impossibility for individuals to escape North Korea at the present because of the tightening restrictions on freedom of movement, for this report we also relied very heavily on in-depth analysis of extensive satellite imagery, of open source videos and photographs, of international trade data, media reports, and obviously contacts within North Korea. And the report documents, just giving you a snapshot, it documents how the DPRK government has largely sealed its northern border and imposed overbroad, excessive and unnecessary restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic, some of these restrictions still being in place today. The North Korean government has implemented measures such as quarantines and restrictions on almost all official trade, international and domestic travel, economic activity, and it's built new security infrastructure along the northern border with China. And this has led to the limiting of official and unofficial trade routes. It's resulted in the people in the DPRK being severely affected in terms of their sources of income, reducing access to cash and the ability to buy already limited food, medicine and necessities. Human Rights Watch's Digital Investigations Lab conducted an in-depth analysis also of the restrictions on the northern border of North Korea, and we selected 6 specific areas along the border to analyse. We found that the authorities there, since the COVID-19 pandemic, have fenced off almost all the analysed areas, have double fenced most of those areas, and have increased the security facilities 20-fold since 2019. This border crackdown has compounded the unintended negative effects of the enforcement of the UN Security Council sanctions since late 2017. And it made almost all unsanctioned domestic and international travel impossible, whether to conduct informal commercial activities or to escape the country. So our report found that whilst it's difficult to gauge the full scope of the human rights and humanitarian impacts of these new restrictions and closures that we documented, what is clear is that the people of North Korea are now almost entirely cut off from the rest of the world and enduring horrific rights abuses and a calamitous humanitarian situation with no end in sight. And, the bottom line for us is that this increasingly grave human rights crisis and the economic situation in the country calls for greater scrutiny from the international community, and UN member states need to urgently consider steps to address North Korea's isolation and this impact on the population. And for us, coming now to the UPR of the DPRK, we think this is one opportunity for both scrutiny and also engagement. For those who are less familiar, the UPR is a unique peer mechanism in the UN human rights architecture. Unlike other expert-led mechanisms, this review and the recommendations that are given by states. So it's a state-to-state process. 100% of the countries, of UN member countries, participate in this process. And we find that it has reasonably strong support from most UN member states, again, unlike some of the other mechanisms of the human rights system. And we think it's particularly important for the DPRK, who's only ratified 5 of the 9 international human rights treaties. Its last reviews under those treaties were in 2017, so some time ago, and its reporting under the main human rights treaties, the ICCPR and the ICESCA, is very overdue, with the last reviews more than 20 years ago. So we think the UPR is one opportunity for further engagement. As you will know, of course, the government also rejects the Special Rapporteur on the DPRK and doesn't engage with that mandate. The government also does not have a standing invitation to special procedures mandates, and there's been only one country visit by a Special Rapporteur, and that was the Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities back in 2017. The government, of course, also rejects the work of the OHCHR Seoul office and refuses to engage with it. So in this context, we think the UPR is an important opportunity to have a discussion about human rights in the DPRK and to engage with the government itself. Since the government has participated in each of the 3 first cycles of the process, of the UPR process, and it's accepted a proportion of those recommendations that it's received from states. Just as a recap, you know, in the previous UPR cycle back in 2019, North Korea received 262 recommendations from states. It accepted 132 of those. It rejected recommendations, unfortunately, on some key areas, including advocating for the abolition of repressive systems, arbitrary executions, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, slavery and trafficking, and the promotion of press freedom and improved detainee treatment. So, you know, this is disappointing, of course, that many of the key recommendations were rejected, but nevertheless, there were 132 that they did accept. Unfortunately, as well, our assessment is that little progress has been made by the government on implementation of those recommendations that it did accept. As you know, the DPRK government is participating again in the 4th cycle. The review is next week, and we think this is an important opportunity to continue to try to highlight the human rights issues in the government, in the country, and to engage with the government. We submitted a joint submission back in April together with the Transitional Justice Working Group. I won't go through the whole submission, but just to outline, you know, the key areas of concern we identified were accountability for crimes against humanity, abuses in political prison camps, abductees, detainees and prisoners of war, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, discrimination and violence against women and girls, economic, social and cultural rights, and cooperation with the international mechanisms and institutions. And as you can imagine, the overall picture since 2019, since the last review, the UPR review, is worse in all of these areas. As I said, I won't go through them all, but I did want to highlight just a couple. First of all, on accountability, which is an area that we have emphasised and feel strongly that needs to have more emphasis from the international community. There has, of course, been no accountability for the shocking crimes and abuses against humanity identified in the Commission of Inquiry's 2014 report. Just back in June this year, when the High Commissioner was addressing the UN Security Council, he described the situation as the DPRK is a country sealed off from the world, a stifling, claustrophobic environment where life is a daily struggle devoid of hope. And he said accountability must be a priority for the international community. And he endorsed referral of the situation to the International Criminal Court, which was originally recommended by the COI. And he also urged states to explore both judicial and non-judicial forms of accountability. So in our UPR submission, we recommended that North Korea grant unrestricted access to UN mechanisms and other independent monitors to investigate the violations, to protect those who provide information to such monitors from any sort of reprisal or retaliation, and to request technical assistance to reform the political and institutional structures to ensure accountability for those who commit rights abuses. We also recommended that the government ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC and implement the statute in national legislation, including by incorporating provisions to cooperate promptly and fully with the ICC and to investigate and prosecute grave crimes in violations of international law before national courts. One other area I wanted to highlight was on economic, social and cultural rights. The picture is again particularly dire, and this is a topic that some of the governments who are allies of the DPRK government prioritise, and so we wanted to underline these particular areas, hoping that they may have some traction with some of those governments. Our submission outlines that the government has persistently failed to fulfil everyone's enjoyment of the right to food. North Koreans are facing chronic food insecurity, with nearly half of the population facing food shortages and early childhood malnutrition leading to general undernutrition since the late 2000s. According to the most recently available data from the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, which is from December 2017, when Kim Jong-un's North Korea was at the peak of economic growth, an estimated 10 million people out of an official population of 25 million experienced food insecurity, and 200,000 children were acutely malnourished. 1 in 3 children under 5 and almost half of the children between 12 and 23 months were anemic. And in July 2023, the UN published a report that estimated food insecurity had increased to 46% of the population between 2020 and 2022. One underlying cause of the country's chronic food insecurity is the government's inadequate production of food domestically and its mismanagement and prioritisation of military and weapons development at the expense of the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights. And the COVID pandemic, we found, intensified these challenges, with trade restrictions leading to price surges and a scarcity of food, medicine and medical supplies. The COVID-19 restrictions blocked most sources of income for a large majority of the population and reduced their ability to buy already limited food, medicines and other essential goods and services. We also mentioned the issue of radiation exposure. South Korea's Ministry of Unification conducted radiation exposure tests for 30 escapees in 2017 and 10 escapees in 2018. And the test results showed chromosomal abnormalities among 9 of them. There are concerns that groundwater sources may have been contaminated by possible leakage caused by 6 nuclear tests. We made recommendations on these issues for the government to urgently invest the maximum available resources, including through international cooperation, to realise economic, social and cultural rights, prioritising the most marginalised communities. We also recommended the collection, publication and circulation of scientific, accessible and comprehensive health-related information, including in relation to COVID-19. And finally, we recommended that the government permit an independent investigation into the risk of radiation exposure from nuclear test sites and taking measures to protect the local population. So that was our UPR submission. In conclusion, for us, the UPR of the DPRK is one of the very few opportunities for scrutiny of the human rights situation in the country, and also one of the few opportunities for any sort of engagement with the government on human rights. Whilst we remain sceptical about implementation, we still consider it's an important process to engage in. Even if sometimes we think the process might feel futile, it's important to continue to monitor, to document and to raise concerns with the government on behalf of the people of North Korea who are unable to raise their own voices. We also think there are avenues for states to use UPR recommendations in their bilateral engagements, particularly those recommendations that have been accepted by the DPRK government, and for states to be raising them when they're engaging bilaterally with the DPRK government. The UPR recommendations can also be used to focus aid and development initiatives and for UN engagement in many different fields, for example, agencies like the WHO, UNICEF, the ILO and others. So I'll leave it there, and happy to answer questions further about the submission later. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, for your discussions on a recent report of UPR. Now I'd like to invite Sean Chang. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers, the Ministry of Unification and Human Asia, for inviting me and the other distinguished guests on this panel. My name is Sean. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Hum Voice. We're a Canadian organization based in Toronto and New York, working to promote human rights in North Korea. We also coordinate a global advocacy coalition of 25 civil society partners, many of whom are in this room, representing over 300 organizations in 100 countries. Our coalition recently organized a ministerial event during the UN General Assembly High-Level Week in New York, co-hosted by the US, South Korea, and Luxembourg. And we were pleased to have Ms. San from the Korean POW Families Association and other divided families, escapees, detainees, abductees, and prisoners of war separated from their families. We are not a research organization, we are not a documentation organization, and so the value that we bring to this panel is the convening that we've done, and in particular, a summit that we hosted in Canada last year in partnership with the Stimson Center, a think tank in DC, and the governments of Canada and the US. We hosted this summit because we wanted to look at what a strategy, given the recent developments around traditional security issues on the Korean Peninsula, we wanted to design our project, our summit, around a single question. And that question would be, what might a strategy centered around the security of the North Korean people look like? We wanted to develop a framework that would develop a link between traditional security interests on the Korean Peninsula and the human security of the North Korean people. And the way in which we did this was to develop a stakeholder-led process where we interviewed over 63 stakeholders, not just within the human rights space, but in government and humanitarian aid, development, and traditional security actors. We had a survey, a broad public opinion survey targeting 500 North Korean escapees with a sample representative of the exile population in South Korea. We had 4 preparatory workshops in Seoul and DC, and then a 4-day summit in the Canadian Rockies. And so I think what we came out with, I think first is on the very first day, I remember one of the traditional security actors raising their hand during the intervention time and asking, well, that's all fine and good, but my interest as a government official is to the North Korean, is to the American people and the security of the American people. And so why is it that I have to care about the security of the North Korean people? And that's kind of what we tried to build together, a consensus amongst those who were there at the summit, a critical group of stakeholders across the North Korean policy space. And not only those who work on human rights, but also members of the UN country team that deliver humanitarian aid, Red Cross. We had longtime resident programs. We had most of the major DC think tanks represented, and of course, high-level government officials, in addition to human rights stakeholders. And what this process resulted in was one of the few recorded successful attempts in bringing together this group to look at where we could find consensus. And I think what we found is that while a traditional security approach has dominated the strategies and policies towards North Korea, this being particularly salient now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the US, Canada, South Korea, and elsewhere, whether it be this kind of fire and fury, God help us if we go back to that, and maximum pressure, summit diplomacy, and maximum engagement, or strategic patience, the first consensus that we came to is that no short-term traditional security strategy has been successful in achieving complete, verifiable, and the irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's weapons of mass destruction. And while we had many divisions, many ideological, many programmatic divisions on the best way forward, the majority of stakeholders agreed that what we wanted to see is a future North Korea that is at peace with its neighbors, feeds its people, and respects the basic rights of its citizens. And whether you're on, and we had folks from the full spectrum of the ideological divide, whether you're for reform in liberalization of North Korea long-term, whether you're for collapse, the conditions are the same. You need in the future, you need a more developed civil society that is at least partially representative and responsive to the needs of a greater portion of the population. The government needs to be accountable to a larger portion of the population. And I think what we discussed was how we can shape particularly with North Koreans at the table, how we can shape the future society that North Korea will look like, which will at least be in part based on the conditions that exist today. And so some of the efforts that are being driven by civil society in expanding vertical and horizontal ties and networks within the population based on information sharing, trust, voluntary association, market mechanisms, mutual solidarity, that will lay the groundwork for the development of future civil society in North Korea in the very long term. And so in line with creating a more holistic, human security focused, and human security more broadly in terms of being free from fear and want, we have a report where we present a comprehensive policy framework featuring 3 complementary policy goals with 9 recommendations and related actions, and I'd be happy to send it to whomever is interested. I'll go through the goals very quickly and then shift into some of the recommendations that we have for the upcoming UPR. I think first is, particularly now, and we heard about the recent Human Rights Watch report and the lack of information that's not only going into the country, but also coming out of the country. The first is closing the information gap. We must ensure that North Korean voices inside and outside the country are central to the conversation. Human rights cannot be improved, nor can human security be truly achieved without listening to the very people living under the regime. The second is aligning stakeholders. And so we need more coordinated efforts across human rights, humanitarian aid, development, and security communities and governments. For too long, I've been to many security conferences, well, not many, but several security conferences where the human rights or the humanitarian aid panel is usually during lunch or is usually the last one before people leave. And so for too long, these groups have operated in silos, and especially given that humanitarian groups are unable to go back into the country at the present moment, there's this opportunity to address the intersection of human rights, development, and security inside the country. And then I think the most important, and something that that we hope to focus on, is catalyzing change on the ground. I mean, I think in a panel yesterday, one of the panelists talked about what can we do now and how can we help the people on the ground now. And so I think supporting the building blocks of North Korean civil society, removing barriers to marketization and access to information, and ultimately empowering the people as agents of change is key. And this requires innovative, interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral humanitarian aid and development projects. It requires greater flows of access to information and knowledge transfer. We all realize we call it different things, but it's just information going into the country to different segments of the population. And of course, and this is targeted more to the governments that we've spoken with, a conducive policy environment that allows for these networks and for capacity to be built across each segment of the North Korean population. And so the kind of implication that this has for the UPR are really along 2 lines. The first is access to information, and so recommendations should focus on increasing access to information to independent media, repealing new restrictive laws, and calling for also an interesting point, something that several of the non-like-minded states have asked for, calling for the dissemination of information regarding North Korea's human rights obligations to citizens as well. And then the second, humanitarian access. So this is one area in which a variety of different member states can push both for the resumption of humanitarian aid and access to North Korea, especially following the COVID-19 pandemic, but also looking at implementing a human rights upfront approach, the system-wide UN approach, and or more generally a human rights-based approach to delivery of humanitarian aid. I think the folks that will be speaking in the next panel and my fellow panelists can talk about the so-called 3 evil laws that restrict the North Korean people's right to freedom of expression. But I think this is really, and I think I saw it in most of the UPR submissions, this is, I think, really our point of focus in allowing for, for there to be broader access to information. But also just noting that in its national report for its 4th UPR, North Korea contends that public awareness-raising activities were also conducted by providing, through mass media or law information workers, explanation of laws on protection and promotion of the rights of children, women, persons with disabilities, and others that incorporate the requirements of international human rights conventions, thus enabling people to be correctly aware of and fully exercise their rights and respect the rights of others. Of course, we know that that's not true in terms of the delivery of such information across North Korean society. But again, they've accepted recommendations from in the third cycle, which looked at disseminating knowledge on international human rights instruments, publishing texts of human rights treaties that DPRK has ratified through its national network service, and so on and so forth. And so we see this as another opportunity to engage with the people on the ground to ensure that they have knowledge of their rights. And then on humanitarian access, very quickly, we believe that the sidelined human rights upfront approach remains relevant as a framework for embedding human rights in humanitarian efforts. And these are core principles that are still, of course, in the previous strategic framework negotiated between the UN country team and the DPRK government, but also just understanding that the UN country team has a role in supporting the regime's implementation of its UPR recommendations and compliance with its human rights treaties. Looking at the country team's role in promoting dialogue, technical cooperation, training on international human rights standards, but of course, I think another interesting recommendation, I think it was Ireland that had provided this recommendation in the last cycle. North Korea accepted a recommendation urging humanitarian access to vulnerable groups, including prisoners. And given that North Korean families already provide food aid during routine visits, this could be an opportunity again to access prisoners, and of course maybe not political prisoners, but lower level prisons, and for aid groups to access those affected detention facilities. Of course, this is a lot of wishful thinking at the moment when the government is not opening its borders to international aid groups, but that's precisely why a lot of the recommendations still stand. The last cycle, securing unlimited humanitarian access to all provinces of the country, I think that was Norway, granting access to the UN and other international humanitarian agencies to provide assistance to the most vulnerable groups, that was Afghanistan, and this was, of course, clear in the second review process as well. I think it's, the last panel, I'm losing all conception of time, so forgive me. But I think yesterday, one of the panelists talking about the UPR said that we need to pair this with other action. And our coalition is currently working during the negotiations of the third committee resolution. We're currently advocating for a Secretary General study to look at the nexus between North Korea's weapons development and human rights situation, something that many civil society groups since the time of the COI, many of the documentation groups here have really contributed a lot to. And so, of course, that's just part of breaking these silos that exist between security, development, and human rights, but also between Geneva and New York, and in ensuring that there's a holistic response to this issue. I think at the end of the day, when we're looking at North Korea's non-compliance of its human rights obligations, we cannot look at it in a silo anymore. North Korea's non-compliance of human rights violations is similar to its non-compliance of security resolutions at the UNSC and elsewhere. And the human rights situation that we see now is no longer internal. As we heard yesterday, it's spilling over the country's borders. There are North Korean-made missiles on the battlefields of Ukraine. There are reports of North Korean soldiers heading to Ukraine to commit human rights violations. And of course, as many of the civil society groups here have done amazing research on systematic abuses, repression, forced labor have allowed North Korea's weapons program to exist in the first place, and it no longer makes sense to address one issue separately from another. And that's why we're advocating, in terms of just looking at a new framework, a different framework, adopting a human security framework that emphasizes the full spectrum of rights of the North Korean people as a foundation for long-term peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. Let me conclude by emphasizing that given the urgency of the security situation, the time to act is now, and the international community must reimagine its approach to North Korea by focusing on the security of the North Korean people, or this rights development security nexus. And this means engaging the North Korean people, strengthening the building blocks of future civil society, and aligning efforts across stakeholder communities and governments to ensure that human security is not an afterthought, but is central to any strategy, any security strategy aimed at international peace and security. We may not have many of the answers today, but we can't afford to wait for perfect solutions. And one area in which we have seen change is the change driven by the North Korean people. And so I hope that they are part of every discussion about the future of their country. And I'm glad that this event has included them. Has included North Koreans, not just as to testify, but also as experts on the situation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Thank you for your insights on security of North Korean people and humanitarian strategy from the civic society in the long term. Hope that we can send humanitarian aid to North Korea and make things change. Okay. Now I would like to turn over Boram Jang. Please begin your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Boram Jang. I'm an East Asia researcher at Amnesty International. So I investigate North Korea's human rights violations. I also oversee Amnesty's work on South Korea, Japan, and Mongolia. So today I'd like to share Amnesty International's submission to the UPR working group, which we submitted this April. Its title is Execution for Expression. So it's primarily focused on freedom of expression issue in North Korea. I will be mainly talking about 3 points. First, I'd like to share a bit of overview of how unresolved Korean conflict actually shapes human rights on the Korean Peninsula, and particularly freedom of expression on young people. And secondly, North Korea's extreme legal restrictions, which the Minister Kim Young-ho and also Sean today has alluded to, on expression and profound impact on young people. And finally, I'd like to share some of our recommendations to the international community. So first, I will start with the context and the impact of the Korean conflict on rights. So for more than 70 years, the Korean Peninsula has remained divided with this prolonged state of conflict, deeply influencing the human rights landscape. So in North Korea, the government consistently invokes the unresolved conflict to justify extreme censorship and surveillance, presenting these measures as essential for national security. However, this environment is only serving primarily to consolidate state power and systematically blocking access to information and suppressing dialogue. For example, for young people, these restrictions are particularly isolating, cutting them off from global discourse and opportunities. This generation, unlike earlier generations that experienced the war and the initial stages of conflict, the young people live with the legacy of war and conflict in the form of restricted freedoms and limited access to diverse ideas. And secondly, about North Korea's recent laws, so-called EVO 3 laws, and its impact on young people. So under international law, freedom of expression is protected by Article 19 of the ICCPR, which North Korea ratified in 1981. And Article 19 guarantees the rights of all people to seek, receive, and impart information of all kinds through any medium, whether spoken, written, or artistic. The UN Human Rights Committee also, general comment also highlighted that this freedom is foundational to individual liberty and essential to a functioning society. And it also enables people to form opinions, share knowledge, and hold their government accountable. Restrictions under Article 19 are permitted only when they are lawful, necessary, and proportionate. But North Korea's restrictions far exceed these limits, criminalizing any forms of independent expression and preventing any form of public discourse or dissent. So recently, since 2020, North Korea enforces these restrictions through so-called evil laws. The first one is law on the elimination of reactionary thought and culture. The second one is Pyongyang Cultural Language Protection Law. The third one is the Youth Education Guarantee Act. So the first law criminalizes the foreign media consumption, especially South Korean content. The punishment is ranging from forced labor to the death penalty. The second law penalizes the use of South Korea slang or South Korean accents. And then the recent media reports indicate severe repercussions of these laws, including public trials of teenagers. The third law mandates the alteration of the ideological stance of young people who are becoming more accustomed to foreign and capitalist culture. And this law's objective is to eliminate any emerging anti-socialist or non-socialist thought among the youth. And this is indoctrinating them to think and behave solely in accordance with the directives from the party or Kim Jong-un. These laws reach deeply into private lives, creating a climate where any deviation from state ideology is met with severe punishment. So especially for young people, these restrictions are particularly harsh. Despite the risk, many youth in North Korea still find covert ways to access outside information, demonstrating their strong desire to understand the world beyond their borders. So Amnesty has been having some primary conversations and interviews with North Korea escapees, and then that revealed that North Korea teenagers know about international stars like BTS. They have even listened to some of their songs already. And then they said, even though it's dangerous, they know it's dangerous, but they wanted to know what's happening outside. And we believe this reflects a significant gap between the government's control and the population's drive to connect and learn. When North Koreans access foreign content, it's severely restricted in what they can express openly. So in North Korea, merely possessing outside knowledge is dangerous, but discussing or acting on it is nearly impossible. And this creates a situation where young people gain awareness, but remain powerless to drive change and leaving them isolated and fearful. So lastly, I would like to share some of the recommendations for the international community. During the last review cycle, so the international community has consistently called on North Korea to align its practices with ICCPR standards. So for example, Italy and Croatia have urged North Korea to honor its obligation to protect freedom of expression, while Costa Rica has encouraged the government to revise its domestic laws to meet international standards. Additionally, countries such as Greece, Luxembourg, and Poland have emphasized the importance of press freedom, privacy protections, and independent civil society organizations. We believe positive changes in North Korea is more likely to occur when people have the opportunities to explore diverse ideas safely. Diplomatic channels alongside UN mechanism can help foster this empowerment by encouraging North Korea to consider rights-respecting reforms. Empowerment through freedom of expression would mean that young North Koreans can ask questions, consider new perspectives, and eventually contribute to a society that values their voices. So in closing, I'd like to highlight that for North Korea's youth, freedom of expression is not just a right, but a foundation for all other freedoms and opportunities. And while sustained international attention and accountability measures are essential, there may be also room for careful and constructive dialogue. So next week, I hope the UN member state to prioritize North Korea's commitment under ICCPR, to remind them they have an ongoing responsibility as a signatory to international standards to uphold these commitments for the benefit of its people. And we believe through diplomatic persistence and commitment to accountability, we can work together towards an environment where freedom, empowerment, and long-term progress become tangible possibilities for North Korean people. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bram, for your discussions on execution for expression in the PRK. All right. I'd like to invite Uni Kim. Please start your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this event today. My name is Uni Kim, and I'm a human rights analyst at the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, or NKDB for short. NKDB is a Seoul-based NGO that was founded in 2003 to investigate and document human rights violations affecting the North Korean people. Since last year, we have held special consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council. We have been preparing for the fourth UPR of the DPRK in multiple ways, monitoring the implementation of recommendations from the third UPR, making stakeholder submissions, drafting potential recommendations for the fourth UPR, and finally developing technical strategies for recommending states to coordinate their efforts in the fourth UPR. Today, I would like to highlight the main takeaways from my research on the DPRK's human rights situation since the third UPR in 2019. Since the third UPR in 2019, we have seen a continuation and exacerbation of several human rights issues in the DPRK. For example, the freedom of movement remains severely restricted, with permits required even for domestic travel, and with countless instances of forced repatriation executed. And the freedom of conscience and religion also continues to be prohibited, with the exercise of Christian, Buddhist, shamanistic beliefs handled as political treason. And more importantly, the DPRK has enacted 3 key laws: the Reactionary Ideology and Culture Rejection Act, the Youth Education Guarantee Act, and the Pyongyang Cultural Language Protection Act, which Boram also emphasized. While the totalitarian regime has always suppressed the freedom of expression and access to information, these 3 laws are alarming in that they represent the first effort or first attempt to establish beyond its criminal code a legal basis for criminality of actions such as the consumption of South Korean drama or the usage of South Korean terms, which are truthfully actions that amount to the rightful exercise of fundamental liberties under international human rights standards. The enactment of these laws were followed by reports of executions with the death penalty established as the maximum penalty. In the national report that the DPRK submitted for the 4th UPR, the country not only makes zero mention of these laws, but also professes that the death penalty is imposed only upon individuals who violate another person's right to life. Thus, the DPRK attempts to force a narrative of rule of law system while failing to acknowledge the explicit steps that it has taken to solidify its rule by law. In comparison, the DPRK has made greater efforts to protect rights applicable to vulnerable groups such as persons with disabilities. However, these efforts also fall short of the nuance and depth required to drive genuine empowerment of vulnerable groups. For example, the DPRK has featured stories of civilians with disabilities on its website, Himang, but access to this website remains confined to foreign audiences. Likewise, employment opportunities provided to persons with disabilities are largely limited to light labor factories or other segregated workplaces, and the distribution of welfare benefits has been skewed towards disabled veterans or those who have a demonstrated record of allegiance to the state. As a result, there continues to be a lack of public awareness on and social inclusion of persons with disabilities. In the 2021 Voluntary National Review, the DPRK claimed that it achieved gender equality a long time ago. The state also advertises educational initiatives it has undertaken for children, particularly digital learning initiatives. However, the most pressing issue of exploitation of women and children remains largely unaddressed by the DPRK. While the majority of North Korean women who defect to China become victims of trafficking in transit, there continues to be an absence of redress mechanisms for these women upon their forced repatriation to the DPRK. In addition, North Korean women lack a reliable safety net against domestic violence, with state intervention observed only in the handful of cases that have managed to cause public commotion. Meanwhile, the state-run Socialist Women's Union of Korea indoctrinates and coerces women to abandon the concept of divorce and to preserve their marriage in the name of socialism. While the DPRK has pursued a number of educational initiatives, such as the digitization of school curricula, these developments have been largely financed by contributions from student families. Amid this lack of free education, children who live in rural or poor areas of the DPRK remain unable to access these educational measures. In addition, children remain subject to forced labor through labor mobilization campaigns that take place as part of their compulsory education. More alarmingly, children are exposed to military education through schools or unions such as the Korean Children's Union. As the DPRK continues to pursue its militarization, it is important to monitor how children are exploited in this process. During the 3rd UPR, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic also raised concerns about the frailty of the DPRK's healthcare infrastructure. Most North Korean residents resort to Changmadang markets to access essential medicine, buying this medicine at prices that spiral out of control under the shortage of supply and the lack of a price ceiling. In addition, deficiencies have also been observed with medical equipment and personnel, especially in rural locations. North Korean escapees who have been surveyed by NKDB have reported having witnessed fatalities due to inadequacies in medical facilities. The escapees further explained that a significant portion of these fatalities have occurred in the process of transporting patients from rural to urban areas. Under this lack of a public health care, the DPRK pursued extreme lockdown measures as opposed to a combination of social distancing and medical responses. The extreme lockdowns took place not only across, but also within borders, and these have involved closing down 장마당 markets, which have served as private sources of medicine from other countries, as well as a basic means of livelihood for many North Korean residents. As humanitarian organizations were denied access to the DPRK during the pandemic, there is limited information on the exact impact. But we can only imagine how much the people have suffered amid this lack of protection for the right to health. And some research on third UPR cycle developments underscore the persisting need to attend to a variety of human rights issues in the DPRK. Civil and political rights, needless to say, are becoming more and more restricted as the DPRK retaliates against the influx of outside information and seeks to maintain control over the actions and thoughts of its people. But even the rights of vulnerable groups, economic, social, and cultural group rights remain in need of significant work. And this is because the underlying fabric of political classicism and civilian exploitation hinders full-fledged progress in guaranteeing the access of all individuals to equal opportunities and protections. The freedom of expression and access to information, the freedom of conscience and religion, the rights of vulnerable groups, the right to health, and the right to education. These freedoms and rights I have discussed today are among the 132 recommendations that the DPRK has supported or accepted in the third UPR. However, we see that the acceptance of these recommendations has not necessarily translated to implementation in the right ways. This is especially true among supported recommendations that have been vaguely worded. Thus, in the upcoming UPR, I encourage recommending states to aim for recommendations that are action-oriented, less prone to interpretation, and more conducive to monitoring. That means avoiding verbs like consider or continue, and going beyond mentioning a general right to pinpoint particular actions where that right applies. Recommendations that meet these standards are perhaps more likely to be rejected or noted, but the success of these recommendations lies in the human rights dialogue they ultimately create, rather than the simple likelihood of their acceptance. To that end, NKDB has drafted potential fourth UPR recommendations for every major issue in the DPRK's human rights landscape, and these recommendations have been made available on our website. Thank you again for listening and coming here out of a mutual interest in North Korean human rights. I hope that we can all make the most out of the upcoming fourth UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Unique, for your discussions, the situation of human rights in the DPRK observed during the third UPR cycle. We have 20 minutes left. Please be finished on time. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. Next, I would like to invite Padanam. Please take your turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kim. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Minister of Unification and Human Asia for inviting me to this conference. I'm Padanam from PS Corps. PS Corps have held a special consultative status from the UN Economic and Social Council since 2012. Our global mission is advocate for North Korean human rights. Today, I would like to address the issues of North Korea's traditional and digital human rights abuses. Since its founding, North Korea's record of human rights abuses has been consistently severe from the country's early days to recent years, including the UN Human Rights Council's first resolution in 2003. While the global community has raised concerns, North Korea has continually denied responsibility for protecting its citizens' human rights, and this is evidenced in their actions online. PS Corps has been examining North Korean human rights abuses in cyberspace, including cyber threats, digital freedoms, and the treatment of IT workers' human rights. Our conclusion is clear: human rights violations are a fundamental part of the North Korean system. North Korea's repression of freedom, privacy, movement, and access to information is well known. For decades, these violations have concerned the international community, and in recent years, North Korea's cyber attacks have added new layers to this problem. These attacks are just an extension of the regime's long-standing behavior. The UN Human Rights Council's 2019 resolution states, "The same rights people have offline must also be protected online." But North Koreans have never had the official chance to learn about the outside world. Their access to the internet is heavily controlled, violating their rights to privacy and information. North Korea's meticulous and repressive surveillance system for its people has expanded online. These human rights violations are part of the strategy to block contact with the outside world and finance illegal activities. Human rights abuses have simply adapted to the digital age. In a sense, online and offline human rights violations have the same root. Another example is North Korean workers abroad. Previously, the regime sent construction workers abroad under exploitative conditions, withholding most of their wages to fund itself. Now North Korea is sending IT workers abroad using their labor under similar exploitative and horrible working conditions. These workers, part of a broader network tied to the North Korean state, suffer from abuse and are forced to contribute to the regime's activities. In 2011, a spokesperson for the Ministry of People's Armed Forces under the DPRK National Defense Commission affirmed that cyberspace is considered a fifth battlefield for the country's strategy, alongside ground, air, sea, and space. This approach shows North Korea views cyberspace as a domain to control, with human rights as the lowest priority. As global sanctions have cut North Korean exports, illicit IT work has become a major source of a foreign currency for a country. In 2022 alone, North Korean IT workers reportedly earned up to $1 billion and profits from illicit cyber activity, including cryptocurrency heist, purportedly financed 40% of the country's WMD, weapons of mass destruction programs. Between 2017 and 2023, North Korean hackers targeted companies in aerospace, shipbuilding, and nuclear engineering worldwide, creating a serious threat to global security. In addition to cyber attacks, these IT operations also involve regular freelance IT work under false identities to earn foreign currency. Living under strict management, they endure abusive conditions similar to forced labor, with reports of wages being stolen and freedoms severely limited. North Korean overseas labor, including IT work, may qualify as forced labor according to the International Labor Organization standards. For example, workers have reportedly had to endure working 16 hours a day with only 1 day off per week. It has also been reported that North Korean overseas IT workers lose up to 90% of their salary to the state. To make matters worse, these conditions seem to have worsened following the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2024, the BBC reported that North Korea exploits IT workers like slaves. A former North Korean IT worker claimed that in 2020, his payments stopped and workers were padlocked in their compound to prevent them from escaping. The same whistleblower reported that underperforming workers were publicly shamed and beaten. I recently interviewed former North Korean IT workers who revealed that they earned money by working as freelance IT professionals for companies in the US and Japan, using false identities in China and Southeast Asia. They explained that their income was tightly controlled and redirected to fund the North Korean military industries, and Workers' Party of Korea. Despite their fear of exposure, they expressed a desire to address the harsh working conditions faced by North Korean IT workers abroad. This system, in which the exploitation and abusive of individual forms, part of a global threat to human rights and security, is indicative of the need for the fundamental nature of the North Korean system to change. Rather than improving its citizens' lives, North Korea uses IT and cyberspace to continue human rights abuses and support illegal programs. The digital realm has become a new stage for the same violations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pada, for your discussions, the new frontier of human rights violations and North Korea's traditional digital human rights abuses. That was new to us and different approach for North Korean human rights. Okay, we finally have one panelist. I would like to invite Ju-il Kim. Please take your turn.
네, 감사합니다. 저는 북한 사람이기 때문에 조선말로 이야기하겠습니다. 현재 런던에 살고 있고요. 그리고 런던을 중심으로 해서 10년 전부터 국제탈북민연대라는 글로벌 탈북민 연대를 구성해서 북한 인권 개선 활동을 전개해 왔습니다. 오늘 이렇게 이 자리를 마련해 준 주최 측과 그리고 오늘 또 이렇게 북한의 인권 상황에 대해서 경청하고자 이 자리를 빛내주고 계시는 모든 분들께 북한 주민의 한 사람으로서 감사를 드립니다. 북한이 2001년도부터 해가지고 2003년도까지 연속적으로 법을 3개씩이나 만들어냈는데요. 그런 법들이 앞으로 제2의, 제3의 그런 법들이 계속 나오지 말라는 법은 없습니다. 북한이 앞으로 체제가 위협이 당할 상황이라면 그런 법을 계속 만들어낼 겁니다. 그런데 그런 법들이 나오게 된 원인은 어디에 기초를 두느냐? 이 이유에 대해서 저는 이야기하려고 합니다. 먼저 그에 대해서 이야기하기 전에 저에 대해서 간단히 북한 생활에 대해서 말씀드리려고 합니다. 저는 강원도 철원군 남가북이 군사적으로 대치하고 있는 그 지역에서 북한군 장교로 근무를 하다가 가혹한 식량난으로 굶주림을 이기지 못해 죽어가는 300만 북한 주민들과 군복 입은 노예로 살아가는 북한의 10대, 20대의 청년들, 군 생활을 강요당하는 청년들의 영양실조 상황, 굶주려 죽어 나가는 상황을 직접 목격하면서 김정일 독재 정권에 저항하고자 북한을 탈출하게 됐습니다. 이후에 아까도 잠깐 언급했지만 이후에 영국과 유럽 또 국제사회에서 북한의 인권 상황을 알리기 위해서 활동을 진행해 왔고 해서 오늘 그래서 북한의 인권의 구조적 문제에 여러 가지 요인이 있겠지만 현실적으로 북한 주민들 입장에서 느끼는 가장 근본적인 문제는 어디에 있느냐? 그에 대해서 제가 이 자리를 위해서 빌어서 이야기하고 싶은 것은 독재 권력을 유지하기 위해서 만들어 놓은 북한에는 당위율 사상체계 확립의 10대 원칙이라는 것이 있습니다. 아직 UCR 보고서에도 그런 게 기록이 되어 있었는지 아니면 과거의 COI 보고서에도 그런 게 기록이 되어 있었는지는 잘 모르겠지만 북한 주민들이라면 누구나 다 인정하고 공감하는 당위율 사상체계 확립의 10대 원칙, 법 위에 있는 초당적 이 법 이 10가지 원칙에 의해서 북한은 당, 정, 군, 쉽게 말해서 당과 군대와 사회가 통제당하고 컨트롤 당하고 있습니다. 이 원칙에는 3대 독재자들에 대한 우상화, 신격화 기준도 있으며 일반 주민들이 일상생활을 할 때 지켜야 될 기준과 행동 지침도 이 원칙에 있습니다. 현재 지구상에서 최악으로 자행되고 있는 북한 정치범 수용소에 끌려가야 해야 되는 이유도 이 원칙에 있고, 북한에서 자행되고 있는 공개처형, 강제북송, 북한 청춘들에게 강요되고 있는 10년 이상의 군복입은 노예제도도 외부 문화 차단과 인터넷 차단, 기타 등의 모든 인권 유린이 이 원칙을 근간으로 하고 있습니다. 그래서 저는 국제사회가 여러 가지 방법과 또 여러 가지 채널과 통로를 통해서 북한 정권에게 이 원칙을 철폐하도록, 당위유사상 체계 확립의 10대 원칙을 철폐하도록 건의하고 요구하고 계속 푸시를 해야 된다는 점을 강조하고 싶습니다. 두 번째로 제가 10년 이상을 북한의 민주화와 북한의 인권 활동을 하다 보면서 느낀 점인데요. 북한 문제를 대하는 외부 세계의 태도도 독재 정권의 인권 유린 범죄를 더 키우고 방치하고 있다는 점도 지적하고 싶습니다. 인권 문제는 사람이라면 누구나 평등하게 누려야 할 보편적 권리고 존엄입니다. 하지만 북한에서만은 인권 문제는 외부 세계에서 정치적 성향에 따라 또 각 정부의 입장에 따라 인도주의라는 맹목적인 지원에 따라 외면을 당할 때가 많습니다. 국제사회의 정치적 상황이 어떻게 변하든 각 정부의 국익이 어떻게 무엇이든 인도주의라는 맹목적인 지원과는 별개로 북한 정권이 인권 유리를 포기할 때까지 인권 문제는 별개의 문제로 다루며 꾸준히 추구해 나갈 과제라고 생각합니다. 배고픈 아이는 정치를 모른다. 1964년에 로널드 레이건 미국 대통령이 인도주의를 강조하면서 말이기도 합니다. 하지만 북한의 인권 문제에 한해서는 인도주의와 인권 문제를 철저하게 구분해서 접근해야 된다는 점을 강조드리고 싶습니다. 세계 유일하게 북한 정권은 공개 처형, 굶주림 이런 최악의 공포를 조성해서 북한 주민을 통제하는 세계 유일의 독재 정권입니다. 해서 맹목적인 인도주의 지원은 오히려 독재 정권에게 인권 유린을 계속하라고 채찍을 쥐어주는 결과로 이어질 수도 있습니다. 외부에서 지원되는 지원 물자를 인민군대에 보내고 정권을 유지하는 인민군대 양성에 쓰여지고 외부에서 지원되는 물자를 정권에 충성하는 핵심계층에 먼저 보내지고 외부에서 지원되는 물자를 주민들에게 제대로 공급을 하지 않으면서 주민들의 충성을 강요하게 만들고 이렇게 북한 정권은 인도주의를 체제 유지에 활용할 가능성이 매우 농후하다는 점을 지적하고 싶습니다. 북한 정권은 국제사회의 인도적 지원을 독재 정권을 강화하는 도구로 주민들의 통제를 강화하는 도구로 만들며 또 핵을 유지하거나 국제사회 질서를 깨는 무기로 사용하기도 합니다. 북한에서 2006년도부터 핵실험이 진행이 돼서 지금까지 오면서 많은 군인들과 군수품 노동자들, 수많은 인력들이 동원되는 그 사람들한테 나라가 돈이 없고 쌀이 없고 창고가 비었는데 뭘 준다고 생각하십니까? 북한은 국제사회를 속여가면서 그런 사람들에게 비공식적으로 공급을 정상화시키고 그런 사람들은 특수 명목으로 국가에서 공급망을 만들어서 공급해 주기 때문에 그런 비쌀 기술, 핵기술 같은 노동자들이 정권을 위해서 충성할 수밖에 없는 구조가 바로 북한의 시스템입니다. 그래서 특별히 북한 정권에 한해서만 맹목적인 인도적 지원보다는 인센티브를 주듯이 한 분야의 인권이 개선되면 지원하고 또 다른 분야의 개선이 되면 지원하는 방법으로 맹목적인 인도주의보다는 조건부적 인도주의로 바뀌어야 합니다. 독재 정권이 국제사회 인도주의를 인권 유린의 도구로 사용하게 할 것이 아니라 인도주의를 통해서 북한 정권이 인권 유린의 문제를 개선해 나가도록 유도해야 합니다. 여기에는 인권주의와 인도주의와 인권 문제는 별개라는 대원칙과 대전략이 전제돼야 되고 앞으로 국제사회 싱크탱크도 그렇고 UN 보고서도 그렇고 NGO들의 보고서에도 이런 원칙을 좀 강조해서 실제로 국제사회에서 논의되는 과정에서 인권 유린의 직접적인 당사자인 북한 주민들에게 최대한 직접적으로 이런 국제사회의 노력이 반영이 되도록 하는 것이 중요하다고 생각합니다. 오늘 이 시간을 빌어서 더 하고 싶은 이야기는 많지만 시간상 관계로 이만하려고 합니다. 경청해 주셔서 감사합니다.
예, 감사합니다. Thank you for your unique personal testimony and discussing the structure of North Korean human rights violations. Different serious issues have been addressed and various approaches have been proposed by our panelists. Now we're going to have a Q&A session. You may have a lot of questions to our panelists. Does anyone have questions? Please don't hesitate to ask. Okay.
Thank you so much, all panelists, for your presentation. Especially thanks 김주일 사무국장님, 인권과 인도주의적 지원 분리해서 해야 된다는 말씀 감사합니다. So my question is one voice. Yeah, because you mentioned that is your one voice, human security and also humanitarian aid. So we sometimes human security and humanitarian aid, this is a context is similar, but what is different in your one voice views?
I knew the first question would be for me. I think the way in which, the way in which we looked at human security was a broader term. And so we didn't, it's not that we're conflating humanitarian aid with human rights. Human rights in and of itself is our inherent rights. And so of course that's not necessarily what we're looking at. I think it's more of looking at, because, and I think this was the larger piece, which is that whether you're a human rights actor or whether you're a humanitarian aid and development actor, none of us are being listened to at the moment because, and depending on the change of administration. And so it was more so building a broader consensus around the need for there to be a holistic approach and for there to need to be one that was more focused on the North Korean people. And that being, through aid and development and human rights, not necessarily to conflate them under one framework. And so it was more so, when we're talking about traditional security, we need to be talking about the security of the North Korean people as a broader, I think, message and as a broader priority. But of course, I think, of course we acknowledge, we're a human rights organization, and so we acknowledge the differences between the different frameworks.
Go ahead.
네, 안녕하세요. 통일만민앞에 대표 김정아입니다. 질문을 사회를 보시는 교수님과 저 역시 순정 대표님께 한보이스 대표님께 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 이 질문은 지금 오늘 저 한보이스 대표님이 말씀하신 것처럼 정보 전달에 대한 문제를 아까 말씀해 주셔서 너무 감명 깊게 들었고요. 그러한 정보 전달의 문제를 말할 때 지금 한국에서 최근에 이슈된 문제가 있습니다. 우리 북한인권 과장님도 계시지만 10월 8일 대한민국 국회 국정감사에서 통일부가 정보 전달에 이러한 북한 인권 시민단체 지원에 관련해서 국방부냐 국정원이냐 심리전을 하냐 이런 것은 통일부가 하는 것이 적절치 않다라는 지적을 받았습니다. 그 국정감사 내용을 보면서 저는 너무나도 북한 인권 피해 당사자로서 탈북 여성으로서 대한민국 국민으로서 너무 자괴감이 들었어요. 북한 인권 개선의 가장 근본적인 문제가 뭡니까? 인권에 대한 인식이 없기 때문에 그들의 인식을 개선하는 것이 바로 정보 전달이라는 의미인데 이것을 어떻게 국정원이나 국방부의 심리전의 문제하고 비교하고 통일부의 이런 국정감사에서 이러한 질의를 할 수 있는 이런 한국 사회의 지금 현재 정치권에서의 잘못된 북한 인권에 관련된 이런 시선에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지 이런 문제에 대해서 이번에 북한 UPR을 관련해서 과연 우리 북한 인권 단체들, 시민 단체들과 북한 인권 피해 당사자인 3만 명의 북한 탈북민들이 대한민국 국민으로 살아가는데 그들에게 과연 어떤 메시지를 전하기 위해서 북한 인권에 관련된 한국 사회의 시선이 왜 무엇이 바뀌어야 되는지라는 문제를 객관적인 입장에서 교수님의 입장에서 두 분의 의견을 꼭 좀 듣고 싶습니다. 혹시 난감하시다면 답변 안 하셔도 됩니다.
지금 한 6분 정도 we have 6 minutes left. 6분 정도 남았는데 3분 해서 먼저 시작하시죠.
Well, I think you should go first, but I think this is why, at the end of the day, we held the conference that we held because we wanted to depoliticize some of these issues. I mean, access to information is a human right, as some of the folks on our panel said, and I think it's unfortunate, especially during the last administration, the way that it was politicized. And so I think that's primarily why we wanted to bring a broader group of stakeholders, both from South Korea, the US, and other places to depoliticize. But I think part of it is also just, and this will always be my pitch, part of it is also there is a lack, I think, of more resources that need to go into not just developing content, but also developing technology that can enable greater access to information, developing the networks that allow for information to go in. And so I think this is a broader problem of a depoliticization of the issue of access to information, and also understanding that for most information that's going into the country, it's not this kind of sinister, bringing in, political content per se. It's more just content that North Koreans are demanding inside the country. So I think that's one. I think the second is just a lack of resourcing in terms of building projects, especially if you look at other contexts. If you look at circumvention technology in Ukraine and the hundreds of millions of dollars that are going in from different governments, I mean, it's peanuts compared to how much the North Korean human rights space is getting to develop the technology and the content that's needed to actually create change on the ground. So that would be my response in terms of the depoliticization, but also the need for more resourcing.
정치권에서 북한 인권 논의하는 것은 있을 수 있다고 생각해요. 그쪽에서 민주당 쪽에서도 그렇고 국민의힘에서도 그렇고 서로 이제 북한 인권을 가지고 정제화하고 있는데 그러나 이제 주무부처로서의 통일부나 외교부나 이런 데서는 이제 북한 인권 활동을 하는 이 단체들에게 지원은 계속 해야 된다고 생각해요. 저는 기본적으로. 왜냐하면 이제 계속 정보 같은 게 들어가야 북한 주민들의 삶이 변하고 마음이 변하고 의식이 변하기 때문에. 그래서 제가 한독 이 포럼에서 제가 제의했던 것이 위성을 통해서 어떻게 정보를 쏘는 방법도 있을 것이다라고 하는 논의도 함께 했었어요, 사실. 그런 걸 이제 정부적 차원에서 해야 되는 것이고, 이 인권 단체 차원에서도 이 정부의 지원을 받아서 끊임없이 해야 된다라고 하는 것은 기본적인 저의 생각입니다. 왜냐하면 인권이라고 하는 것은 사실 북한 주민들의 목소리를 대변하는 거거든요. 그 피해자들의 입장에서 우리가 좀 대변할 줄 알아야, 국제사회에서 대변을 해야만 하는 그런 상황이기 때문에 그래요. 그들 스스로가 북한 인권을 주장할 수는 없잖아요. 저도 이제 집결소도 가봤고 노동단련대도 가봤습니다만 거기 안에 있는 사람들이 북한 인권을 생각할 수도 없고 그런 환경도 아니고, 그래서 우리가 적극적으로 나서서 그들을 대변해 줘야 된다 생각합니다. 그다음 두 번째로는 북한인권재단을 빨리 설립해야 돼요. 사실 북한인권재단을 설립해서 북한의 가해자들의 이 명단을 우리가 수집을 해야 되거든요. 그러니까 정훈이의 어떤 행태만 우리가 수집하는 게 아니라 이 김정은이가 명령을 해서 그걸 움직이는 사람들이 있을 거 아닙니까? 그죠? 관료 조직이. 관료 조직들의 이름과 그들의 신상까지 우리가 다 수집을 해야 됩니다. 그게 북한인권재단이 할 역할이고, 그걸 해야 되고, 또 두 번째로는 지금 북한인권 협력 대사가 있어야 돼요. 북한인권 협력 대사가 있어야만이 공공외교와 북한인권을 결합해서 국제사회에 적극적으로 호소할 수 있거든요. 납북자 문제도 그렇고 북한인권 문제도 그렇고 뭐 강제수용 문제도 그렇고 그런 것들을 다양한 국가를 돌아다니면서 호소하고 알리고 이런 활동을 해야 됩니다. 그게 우리 북한인권법 통과된 취지 아닙니까? 그러니까 이런 것들을 해야 되는데 그것을 좀 정부가 적극적으로 나서길 바라는 마음입니다. 이상입니다. Okay, I think we have to stop here. Time is up. Thank you for your participation and thank you our panelists. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kim and the panelists for the fruitful discussion. This concludes the third session. We'll take a very short coffee break and reconvene for the fourth session at 10:40. Thank you very much.